Hi, everyone. I'm David Carlin, and I'm here today to talk about the effects of the Trump administration's policies on global climate finance because there's some big changes, and I break it down all for you with some nice visuals and some explanation from across the world and what this means, these rollbacks and changes for overall climate finance, as well as some of our climate goals and some of the most urgent challenges that we're facing. So to begin, we have really seen, I think even more than was expected, a real full-throated repudiation of not only the overall climate agenda, but really even many of the things that economically have made sense under the Biden administration, such as the growth of solar and wind. We've seen attacks on electric vehicles, surprising, of course, because Elon Musk has been so close to this government, but also we've seen not just the international walkbacks, pulling out of the Paris Agreement, and we'll talk in a few minutes about some of the effects on the big areas of the just transition partnerships, but also talking about other international commitments. What's surprising, as I said, is not the pullback on these, but actually the pullback on some of the more economical elements that are already profitable, already making money, and in many cases taking place in red states. So let's talk about the international scene, though, because this ties it all together in terms of where climate finance is flowing. Until this administration, the United States has been the single biggest country donor on climate finance, providing about 8% of global climate finance. And in fact, that number is probably significantly bigger than that because of obviously the influence that the US financial system has over the private sector institutions, as well as the commanding role that Washington has over development financial institutions such as the World Bank and IMF. Importantly, let's talk about probably one of the most destructive things that's happened, which has been the near complete elimination of USAID. This is where over 60% of America's foreign aid budget has gone to in the past, about 43 billion a year, and they've had broad ambitions on climate change. They've worked on adaptation and resilience, the effects of health and public policy, as well as areas of development on regenerative agriculture, on green energy, and on many other important moves. So we've seen this completely be swept away. And the fact is, these are things that are hurting people today. They're also potentially hurting America's role in the global climate discourse, even outside of the Paris Agreement. And the US is pulling out of more than just the Paris Agreement. We've seen it leave the commitments that it made to the Green Climate Fund, the world's largest climate fund, to the level that now Sweden, a nation with 1/50th of the economy of America, is actually providing more to the fund. Furthermore, we've seen moves that are really political in nature. And we can see this because, for example, the Just Energy Transitions Partnership that America exited that was providing financing to move countries like Vietnam and South Africa past coal, these were loans. So this wasn't a credit issue, this wasn't an economic issue, but rather a political one. And then finally, on that signature accomplishment of COP27, many of you remember the Loss and Damage Fund for vulnerable nations, the US has also walked away from its commitments there. So where does this leave overall climate finance? Well, climate finance already was facing a yawning gap, with adaptation even a bigger gap, in order to get on track, not only to have a resilient future, but also a climate stabilized future. Estimates are from the Climate Policy Initiative that overall financing needs to grow somewhere between 5 to 8 times in the next decade or so if we are to reach some of our climate goals, bring countries onto those critical trajectories with clean energy, with resilience. And yet at the same time, by lagging further behind that, we end up creating a world that may be more chaotic. Think more migrations, may also be slower to decarbonize, more coal use. So not only are we making the problem worse, but we are also exacerbating many of the effects of it. Within the United States, some of the downsides are going to be less energy diversification, less growth in new industry. That's going to hurt producers in America. But at the same time, internationally, America's influence is strongly diminished by its lack of presence on the international stage on this critical issue, but also by its lack of provision of finance and by it increasingly being seen as an unreliable partner in this space. However, climate finance itself is not dead by any means. Domestically, we're seeing growth in other countries. So China spent about 800 billion domestically on clean energy. We're also seeing on the international front commitments from the EU and others stepping in to try to fill some of that gap. But the fact is we need all the money we can to drive for climate change and climate action. And if we don't do that, we're going to have an even harder road ahead. So does the US make this problem unsolvable? No, but it certainly slows the timeline down, and it certainly creates many of the effects we are trying to avoid. Well, I hope you found that analysis helpful. If you'd like to hear more or learn more, you can find these slides for paying subscribers at our newsletter. You can also find multiple stories a week where we cover the biggest news, the most important developments, and you can check us out on our podcast, The Big Questions, as well.